Okay, good evening, comrades. I'd like to welcome everybody to the weekly political meeting of Online Communist Forum hosted by the Communist Party Provisional Central Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain. As is usual, this evening's meeting will be introduced by Jack Conrad, who will speak on the main political issues over the past week and the week to come. Jack will speak for approximately an hour, more or less, and then there'll be opportunities for questions and discussion. To enable discussion, comrades, at the end of Jack's introduction, we're going to make you all panelists. So you need to accept the invitation to be a panelist if you want to speak. Now, you don't have to speak, obviously, so you don't have to put your mic on or your webcam on, obviously, if you don't wish to speak. So with that, John, I'll pass over to yourself.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, well, I'm going to begin with Israel and the announcement by the official trade union, the Heraustat, that it's calling a general strike. And this is over the question of hostages, and it's linking that, obviously, with the demand for a ceasefire, because the idea that the IDF's military operation in Gaza is designed to get hostages back alive is clearly a nonsense. You know, Netanyahu sheds many crocodile tears, not least over the latest 6 bodies that have just been recovered. But clearly he doesn't want negotiations with Hamas. He doesn't want a ceasefire with Hamas. Of course, he blames Hamas for that. But it's Netanyahu and his government that are determined to wipe out Hamas, of course, as his own ministers, including his Minister of Defense, including spokespeople for the IDF, have said that's impossible. You know, Hamas is a political movement. It has mass support in Gaza, and of course it has mass support also on the West Bank. So yes, you can kill fighters, but you're not going to destroy Hamas. So clearly there's another reason for this military operation, which I'm not going to go into now. But clearly it's not about securing, Israelis captured on October the 7th back. So what's the nature of this general strike? I think it's clear that it's a political general strike, and it's clear that it isn't an act of the independent working class. All you need to do is read any report about the announcement of this action, which I believe begins 8 o'clock tomorrow, and you'll find out the true nature of it, because in Israel, a load of private companies are supporting the strike. And basically, this is the opposition calling its supporters out on the streets in order to pressurize the government to change course. Those that are committed to a two-state solution will undoubtedly take solace and indeed perhaps even inspiration from this call. But I personally think that it's worthwhile thinking back that last time the Trade Union Federation called a general strike, it was over the question of the Knesset versus the Supreme Court. And a lot of sort of liberal opinion, both in Israel and beyond, basically looked at the Netanyahu government and its proposal to overthrow the right of the Supreme Court to veto Knesset resolutions, Knesset votes, as some sort of defense of democracy. In my own, from my own angle, I think that's a travesty. What is clear is that the opposition, because it can't get a majority when it comes to elections, and remember, Israel has a pretty fair PR system. It's not as good as South Africa, but nonetheless, it's certainly vastly superior compared with Westminster and elections to the House of Commons. But the fact of the matter is that the opposition cannot get a majority, cannot put together a coalition, and therefore it sees the Supreme Court as its defense against what? Of course, a right wing, an extremely right wing government, but nonetheless a right wing government that has a majority in the Knesset, through very complex, wheeling and dealing and deals. Nonetheless, that is the point. So tomorrow's general strike, tomorrow's demonstrations are not a prelude to working class and Palestinian unity. This is within the sphere of Zionism. This is about a struggle for the direction of Zionist Israel, not a struggle against Zionist Israel. So we should never forget that it was the Labour government that seized the West Bank and seized indeed Gaza. That was later abandoned in terms of at least settlers, but it was a Labour government that seized the West Bank and clearly had no intention of letting it go. So you've had a whole series of different governments in Israel, either proceeding fast or proceeding slow when it comes to putting colonies on the West Bank and going for annexation. So, for example, the Golan Heights and, of course, East Jerusalem. But clearly, there's an ambition for a greater Israel shared by all significant forces of Zionism. Meanwhile, of course, we have the IDF's operation on the West Bank, and that's included not only invading towns, but also after besieging towns like Jenin, the IDF has issued orders for the civilian population to exit. In other words, we're into the same sort of military tactics that we've seen on a bigger scale, of course, in Gaza. And it's true that in terms of the IDF's operation, they've killed various Hamas and other fighters, including Hamas's commander in Jenin. But it's also clear, and it surely is clear to, Israeli intelligence, the political class, that for every, militant that their forces kill on the West Bank, 100 young men will come forward in order to take revenge because of what the IDF has done, not only in terms of killing, but terrorizing the local population. And clearly, the whole record of terror meted out by their settler population. So that's why, at least as far as I'm concerned, that what things are about in the longer term isn't a military operation in order to suppress the population, but something grander, something on the scale of 48. In other words, a second Nakba, a forcible removal of the indigenous Palestinian population. In 48, they forced people out onto the West Bank. This time, it looks like they intend to force people out of Sinai, into Sinai, but this time out of the West Bank. And whether that also includes, the Arab population in Israel itself, that's a different question. Nonetheless, if Greater Israel is to be a democracy, you've actually got to change the population makeup, and that means getting rid of the Palestinians. Okay, just quickly, Lebanon, we've had the preemptive airstrikes on Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon. We've also had the provocation carried out by Israel, first of all, in terms of striking Iran's embassy in Damascus, and then assassinating the negotiator, one of the Hamas leaders, in Tehran itself, over for the inauguration ceremony for the new president. And in terms of what I've been reading, and this is the Western press, I have had a look at the Iranian media as well. But in terms of the Western media, what you get in general is that Iran is holding back from retaliation. Iran doesn't want a regional war. We could have told them that a long time ago. It's clear that Iran doesn't want a regional war. It doesn't want one now, and it doesn't want one tomorrow. So who knows what form Iran's retaliation will take. The line is that we will do it in our own good time. So we wait for that. It's obvious that if they do retaliate, Israel will use it to up the ante, because what needs to be understood, of course, is it isn't Hezbollah that wants war. It's not Hamas that wants war. It's not Iran that wants war. It's Israel that wants war. And I think that you could say its main objective, yes, as I've already explained, is a greater Israel, is getting a regional situation that provides a convenient excuse for carrying out a second round of ethnic cleansing. But there's also its war against Iran. And again, I don't know, it'd be worthwhile looking at, but it's clear that in terms of doing Iran, Israel wants to involve the United States. Now, whether that's because it simply hasn't got the military capacity to rain death and destruction on Iran, to throw Iran back, to use a phrase, back to the Stone Age, I don't know. I suspect that is the case, but clearly the United States, at least at the present time, is reluctant to be dragged in. And of course, that could all change in November with the presidential election. And, if you were Netanyahu, that is something that you will be praying for every night, i.e. a Trump victory over Harris. Meanwhile, of course, we have the election of a reformist president in Iran. And with the blessing of the supreme leader, what we get from the Iranian media is their keenness to engage with the West, and that includes the United States, in order to do a new nuclear deal. If we look at the new Iranian foreign minister. For example, here was someone who was actually responsible for negotiating the first nuclear deal, which of course was reneged on by the United States in the form of the Trump administration. So my guess would be, while Netanyahu is praying for a Trump victory in November, Iran, both the supreme leader and the president, are praying for a Harris victory. It's not because Harris and the Democrats are peacemongers. It's more their perception of Trump's relationship with an aggressive and expansionist Israel. It's Trump that talks about getting the job done. I take that as code for intensification of war and also for annexation of territory, either parts of the West Bank or the whole of the West Bank. Okay, moving on, just touch on the situation in Ukraine, because what we have is reliable reports from Donetsk of Ukraine remaining on the back foot, and Russian forces slowly grinding forward to two key points. That's Podrosk, where their forces are something like 10 kilometers away, and Chavez Yas. And apparently that particular town, of course, it's got no people left in it, is high up. And so it's of strategic importance. And what we have is the possibility of Russia gaining a strategic victory in the Donbass. I'm very loath to call every hamlet, every town a strategic question. In this case, though, I think that is the case. So, for example, I was very skeptical about Bakhmut being a strategic target or something that was so strategically important that Zelensky, for example, was willing to sacrifice so many thousands of Ukrainian soldiers for. For me, it was much more symbolic question. I don't think that we're dealing with something that's purely symbolic in this particular case. It doesn't mean that Ukraine is about to fall, but nonetheless, this would be a significant victory for the Russian forces if they achieve it. And according to the reports, Russia wants to achieve it before winter. I think myself that actually it's not a question of before winter. It would have to be something that they achieve pretty soon, because while in the Ukraine armies can fight in the winter, it becomes very problematic fighting in the rainy season. And the rainy season is spring, but it's also autumn. And what you get is not mud that's knee-high, you get mud that can stop tanks. And just as important, perhaps more importantly, it stops trucks, because what we're dealing with here isn't, neat paved roads leading up to the front line. What we're dealing is dirt tracks that turn into quagmires with the rains. And if you haven't got trucks, if you can't move your trucks, then you can't bring up the fuel for the tanks. You can't bring up the ammunition for the tanks. You can't bring up the ammunition for the artillery. You can't bring up the food for the guys that are suffering in the front line trenches. In other words, things tend to shut down in the rainy season, gear up somewhat in winter when the ground is frozen. Tanks can move, trucks can move. It's damn bloody horrible, but people can fight under those conditions where, as I said, in spring, in autumn, it becomes extremely difficult. So for what it's worth, Russia has to keep grinding while the rains, while they wait for the rains to arrive. Meanwhile, we have reports, I think pretty predictable reports in terms of the Kursk front, that Ukrainian advances have slowed down. I think if you were fair, you would actually say they've stopped. And I would go along with those that are predicting on both sides that they will be digging and preparing for a static front. I see no evidence myself, and although Russian forces in Kursk have been reinforced, they haven't diverted any significant numbers from the Donbass front. So, as I say, it looks like that will become a frozen front. Russia won't be throwing in wave after wave of troops, as they are in Donbass, to take back the territory of Mother Russia. That will remain in Ukrainian hands, who knows how long. But meanwhile, they are prepared to pay the price for advancing in Donbass. Just one final point on Ukraine. What we have is, pretty consistent reports of long distance strikes by Ukraine, either using missiles, but more usually drones on Russian infrastructure, not least oil and gas facilities and power plants. So my understanding is, I think about 3 power plants were hit over the last short period. My own feeling is that isn't really where the war is going to be decided. The war isn't going to be decided by knocking out this power plant in Ukraine or that power plant in Russia. My own assessment is that it's not even going to be decided on the battlefield. It seems to me that neither side, at least as things stand at the moment, are capable of delivering a knockout blow. That doesn't look like it will happen. So I think that what we're dealing with ultimately is the thing will be decided in the realm of politics. And in terms of that, I include not only what's happening in Washington, i.e. the November presidential elections, but also what's happening in Moscow, but also Kiev. Note the criticisms of Zelensky for the operation in the East. A humiliation for Putin. But on the other hand, if they lose 2 or more strategically important towns in the Donbass, that could actually lead to, I don't know, threats against Zelensky, demands that he submit, for example, to elections. I don't know. Either way, I think it's politics that are the crucial question here. Okay, just moving now to Germany. We have regional lander elections today. And of course, the headlines are dominated by the real prospect of the AfD, Alternative for Germany, doing extremely well, maybe emerging as the leading party in Thuringia. It's neck and neck, apparently, at least in terms of opinion polls in Saxony. This is in the east of Germany, the former GDR, of course. And indeed, if you actually look at the opinion polls, there is even the possibility of the present, I don't know, would you call it a traffic light coalition? I think that's what they call it. But the SDP, Green, Free Democrat governing alliance being humiliated in the polls and perhaps even being knocked out in one or maybe even two regional elections. Who knows? Either way, I think myself that we need to understand, what's going on here. Clearly, there's a reaction to migrants. I think that that's impossible to ignore. Under the CDU, the Christian Democrat government, Angela Merkel, I don't know the exact number of Syrian and Afghan refugees that were given entry into Germany, but 500,000, that sort of figure rings a bell. It could have been more, but that also goes hand in hand with a history of the former GDR basically being the poor part of Germany, and the fact that the German powerhouse has been the sick man of Europe for a whole number of years now. And if you add on top of that the Ukraine war, where it isn't simply a question of Germany sending, Leopard 2 tanks and other such armaments, but more a question, far more of a question of its whole, how should I put it, energy strategy being completely destroyed by the Ukraine war. So we had the demand from the United States that no more contracts for cheap oil and gas. And the matter was, of course, decided by those 4 bombs deep in the Baltic. Apparently, I don't believe it, carried out by some divers from Ukraine. I'm very skeptical myself about that story. Either way, we don't have Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 operating anymore, and therefore Germany has been denied cheap Russian oil, but crucially cheap Russian gas, and has to buy its oil and gas on the international market. And clearly the prices that its industries are having to pay are significantly higher, and therefore, of course, its industries are less competitive than they once were, which of course has an effect on the whole of Europe, not least the German economic zone, which includes, Poland, the Czech Republic, Austria, the Netherlands. That whole area really is, when it comes to industry, when it comes to the economy, to all intents and purposes, part of a greater German economic space. There are those, of course, who blame Germany for giving up nuclear power. I think they phased out their last nuclear power station last year, 2023. I'm not convinced by that one either. I personally prefer it's the Ukraine stupid and the general capitalist downturn that we've seen since the financial crisis, but also the COVID crisis. World capitalism hasn't bounced back from that. And if there is any bounce back going on, I would argue that that's in the United States, and that's to do with its arms industry acting as a stimulus, not only in terms of supplying vast amounts of armaments to Ukraine, but generally, ramping up NATO arms spending. They call it defense spending. American demands of 2%, 2.5% of GDP being spent on the so-called defense of NATO. Okay. I think it's also just worthwhile adding in, having talked about Thuringia and Saxony, the third party when it comes to opinion polls, because I have to say, I was listening to a BBC report the other day, and I have to say that I went, what? To the reporter who was describing the Sarah Wagenaar Alliance. What a name of an organization, by the way. Even George Galloway doesn't name his, Workers' Party of Britain, the Workers' Party of George Galloway. Either way, this party is running third. This is in the former landers in ex-GDR. So, for example, in Thuringia, it's on 17%. That compares with the CDU's 22% and the AFD's 30%. So the BSW, as I will call Sarah's alliance, is ahead of the left party, De Linke, and way ahead of the SDP, the Social Democratic Party, the leading party in the present traffic light coalition government in Berlin. My own take is that the BSW is much more of a German version, or maybe it should be the other way around. Maybe George Galloway's Workers' Party of Britain is a British version of the BSW. Either way, I would describe it as a left-wing organization. Plenty of criticisms there. I'm not saying it's left-wing and therefore you praise it. I simply wouldn't characterize it as the same sort of organization as, for example, Alternative for Germany, or for that matter, the CDU. It's clearly from the left. Wasn't Sarah the sort of leading personality in the left party, former leader of the communist platform, if I'm not mistaken, in De Linke? Someone who has a bit of nostalgia for the former GDR. No, I would describe her as a left-winger. And perhaps this is something that we should watch very carefully, because it would seem to me that if you have success in Germany, not just for the AFD, but also for the BSW, there will be those that will want to emulate it. Well, clearly there's plenty of emulators or people who have already been there before when it comes to the far right gaining respectability. All we need to do is think about the government that today exists in Rome, the former MSI, the former fascists, the Brotherhood of Italy and Maloney. But also, I think there could easily be those that want to emulate the BSW in other parts of Europe and indeed globally. And just on that, it's worthwhile looking at some articles written in the Morning Star, not least those that are coming from the former straight leftist faction, who are making, how should you put it, approving noises, I'll put it no stronger than that, of the BSW. And in other words, if they can do it, we can do it. And the formula is clear. So-called left wing, I mean, take that as you will, that's basically Keynesian economic policies, tax the rich, nationalization, subsidies, it's that sort of agenda, but tough on migration and tough on law and order. So where, for example, the CPB clearly hasn't succeeded, maybe a reinvented CPB, maybe a greater Workers' Party of Britain, maybe an expanded Galloway party. I don't know. But the reason I'm saying it is not because I'm looking forward to such a prospect. I'm basically saying it because I fear such a prospect. We need to be fighting such a prospect, and we ain't going to fight. We're not going to be successful in fighting that if we simply issue scare warnings. We've actually got to build a viable alternative on solid programmatic foundations, i.e., while I think, for example, Stand Up to Racism played a very useful role in terms of the recent riots, clearly that's not enough. Clearly we need a party, and clearly we need an internationalist perspective. We need, in short, a communist party, not some unpopular or semi-popular, but a popular front. We don't need a popular front, and we certainly don't need a BSW or a George Galloway party. Just to move on, what a surprise. The BBC, 3 cheers, because it sent a reporter round to Jas Athwell's properties in Redbridge in East London. Remember last week I was remarking about the petty bourgeoisification of the Labour Party. Well, of course, you've had trade union officials previously dominating the ranks of the parliamentary Labour Party, true, decades ago, but I would include the trade union bureaucracy as a petty bourgeois layer. But now we have, not dominating, but nonetheless a significant presence of rentiers in the Labour Party. And of course, the leading rentier is Jas Athwell, and I think his property portfolio, owned with family members, was something like 14 residential properties and 3 commercial properties. And the BBC sent reporters round, and the tenants that they interviewed were complaining about black mold and ant infestations, and they were also saying that if we complain, the landlord's agents basically threaten us with eviction, no fault eviction, which is a pretty awful prospect. So you're living in highly unpleasant, unhealthy circumstances, and if you ask, if you demand that the landlord actually fulfills their legal duty, you're threatened with eviction. And okay, the BBC was reporting as they were talking to tenants, tenants were getting phone calls from the agent saying, don't talk to reporters, it will be bad for you. Of course, he didn't know anything about that, did he? Well, I don't know. All I can tell you is I'm a renter, for example. I happen not to be a renter that can be threatened with, no fault eviction. I'm a secure tenant. Thank God. It doesn't exist anymore. Either way, I've been complaining about my landlord to the local council, and my local council person who came around, we had the landlord there and we were going through what was wrong with our flat. He said, well, I don't know anything about it. I rely on the agent. This person, I live in Camden, she turned around to him. It was really quite good to watch, I have to say. She said, well, okay, you say you've got so many properties, you don't know what, it's your duty to know what's going on. That is your duty as a landlord. And I say that is also true with Jas Athwell. It's no good simply saying you didn't know anything about it. If you didn't know anything about it, it's your duty to know about it. I wouldn't, of course, accuse him of lying. Nonetheless, it has to be said that someone like him, along with other rentiers in the House of Commons and indeed in the House of Lords, have a material interest to keep tenants in a vulnerable position, in an exploitable position where if they complain, they can be threatened with eviction. From our own angle, we're in favour of social housing, cheap but good quality, high quality housing. Our aspiration isn't little rabbit hutches, but it's the sort of vision that social democracy, for example, in Austria, in Red Vienna, in the 1920s had when it built Karl Marx Hof in Vienna. It not only had its kitchens, it also had its workers' defense squad. Anyway, just finally, or penultimately, just to comment on Sir Keir Starmer, the Rose Garden speech, the general miserablism of the message coming from the new government. Clearly, this is meant to prepare us for the budget. Maybe it's meant to prepare us to expect, a bloody awful budget, and what they do is deliver a few sweeteners. Who knows? Either way, what they're promising is austerity. They're certainly not promising jam. I think that was pretty bloody obvious throughout the general election campaign, and it's certainly why I have to say was somewhat stunned by certain quarters of the left who talked about a crisis of expectations. To have a crisis of expectations have to be raised. And what we had with Rachel Reeves and Sir Keir and the Labour Party front bench was a systematic attempt throughout the general election campaign to lower, to minimise, to actually have no expectations from this Labour government, except it would be more efficient. It would be less crazy. It would be more responsible than the Sunak, Liz Truss, Boris Johnson, Cameron years of Tory rule. Anyway, just in closing, to show that there's still money available when it comes to this Labour government, I'm not going to talk about arms spending. They did promise throughout the general election campaign that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force wouldn't go without. And indeed, I think in the manifesto, there was a commitment to up Britain's percentage of spending on arms up to 2.5% at the end of the government. So no immediate promises of more, but in the longer run, yes, they could be spending more on the means of destruction. But okay, what we also have just recently over the last few days is the announcement that the British government has given the go-ahead, that's effectively what it is, to Sizewell C. That's in Suffolk. This is a nuclear power station. At least, I don't know whether they are the major shareholder, but I think they are, is EDF, that's the French nationalized energy company. And so far, the British government has handed over 2.5 billion in terms of development costs. I presume that's preparing the ground, the plans, I don't know. Either way, it's just agreed a further 5.5 billion pounds to get the project going. We're promised that it will take 9 years to build. I think you have to take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Usually such projects overrun significantly in terms of time. On the other hand, this is a mirror image of Hinkley Point C. It's the same model that, okay, has been delayed, but one would assume that the teething problems of Hinkley Point C won't reoccur in Sizewell C. I don't know. Either way, 9 years is the promise, and a total cost of 20 billion. Okay, that's over not 1 year, but something like 10 years. Nonetheless, Rachel Reeves is, of course, complaining about a 22 billion black hole. And my message is that if you need something done, the money is there. You can find the money. I'm not advocating tax the rich as a magic wand. The problem with the rich is that they're rich and they can always relocate and they can always move their capital. And if you rely on taxing the rich, you don't want to tax them too much because what they are is the goose that lays the golden egg, and you have to keep the goose there. And so hence, for example, with the city, you don't want to over tax it because it can just up sticks, move to Frankfurt, move to Paris, move to New York, and therefore that would deny the present British government, certainly since the Big Bang, of a huge source of revenue. So the easy slogans of the left really do need to be questioned. We're in favor of the expropriation of capital. And of course, that has to be done, in our view, at the very least on a European scale, but ultimately, of course, on a global scale. And what we're after isn't capital of a financial variety. What we're after is the means of production, the means of transport. That's the socialist project, to bring that into social ownership. And with that, I shall conclude. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Just before we open the discussion up for any questions, this is a general comment for everybody here today. The Palestine demo, remind everybody, the Palestinian demo, I'll put details up, or the host may put details up in the chat. Next Saturday in London at 11:30 is the meeting point at the Reform Club, number 140 and in Pall Mall. But again, I'll put those details up. Just a question for you, Jack, again on Palestine, Israel, and the Middle East. I mean, you've frequently commented now on the so-called one state and two state solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and why we're not in favor of it. Could you advocate what kind of solution you think socialists should strive for in the Middle East, in that area?
Do you want me to do that now, Bob, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, so while you're transferring people, perhaps, I don't know.
Yeah.
Either way, yeah. I mean, basically, the argument would be that one, a two-state solution is delusional. It cannot be delivered. There's no way, other than lip service, any serious political forces in Israel, other than the Arab population, will actually want that implemented. So the Palestinians, by their own efforts, are clearly incapable of that. Those who argue to the contrary, well, they should look at Jenin, they should look at Gaza. It's clear that they haven't got the strength, and nor, as I've indicated, has the access of resistance. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran are in no position to impose any sort of settlement on Israel. One state, well, the problem is that something like 80% of the Israeli Jewish population consider themselves secular. And the fact of the matter is, when you come to a one-state solution, if we're talking about a secular democratic solution, it turns out to be not democratic. And in my estimate, at least, that means that what I would consider the Jewish Israeli nation, the Hebrew nation, will fight against a situation where they become effectively second-class citizens. I just don't see them doing that. On the other hand, a regional socialist solution, that is something that, while it appears to be, and no doubt is, a long way off at the present time, that's a conceivable democratic, civilized solution, because what you can do potentially with that is to turn around to the Israeli working class at the moment, that's hand in glove, yes, with the forces of liberalism and capitalism, as we see with the general strike. And what you're offering them is becoming part of the ruling class, as part of a wider federation in the region. So that's our argument, very briefly put.